The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when a well-dressed black man in his mid-30s walked through the airport terminal, rolling his carry-on suitcase behind him. His calm demeanor and confident stride reflected his 15 years of experience as a commercial airline pilot, though today he was traveling as a passenger to Chicago, where he'd be commanding his next scheduled flight. He'd done this journey countless times before, going through security, checking his gate, and grabbing his usual pre-flight coffee from the airport cafe. The barista, who had come to recognize him as a regular customer, greeted him with a warm smile and started preparing his order before he even reached the counter. "The usual for my favorite pilot?" she asked cheerfully, already adding a splash of almond milk to his dark roast coffee. As he approached Gate B7, he could see the massive aircraft that would carry him to Chicago. Flight 2317 was scheduled for an on-time departure, and the gate area was already filling up with passengers. He had used his airline miles to upgrade to first class, something he occasionally did on longer flights when seats were available. After all, the extra legroom made a difference when you were 6 feet tall. The boarding process began smoothly enough. He waited patiently in the first-class line, scrolling through weather reports for his upcoming flight to Chicago on his phone. When it was his turn, he presented his boarding pass to the gate agent, who processed it with a professional nod. However, the atmosphere shifted noticeably when he stepped onto the aircraft. A flight attendant, who had been warmly greeting other first-class passengers, suddenly adopted a different demeanor. Her smile became forced, her eyes narrowed slightly, and her tone lost its warmth. "Your boarding pass," she demanded, despite having just watched him hand it to the gate agent. He calmly reached into his jacket pocket and presented it again. She scrutinized it longer than necessary, looking between him and the document multiple times. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" she questioned, her voice carrying a hint of suspicion that made several nearby passengers glance up from their phones and magazines. First class is quite expensive. He maintained his composure, something he'd learned to do over years of dealing with similar situations. "Yes, I'm sure. Seat 3A, window seat," he replied politely, pointing to his assigned spot. His voice remained steady, though he couldn't help but notice how she had welcomed the passengers ahead of him without questioning their presence in first class. Making his way to his seat, he could feel her eyes following him. As he stored his carry-on in the overhead compartment, she hovered nearby, watching his every move as if expecting him to cause trouble. A businessman in the aisle seat barely looked up as he moved past to take his window seat. The flight attendant's behavior didn't stop there. During the pre-flight service, while she offered other first-class passengers their choice of welcome drinks with a smile, she practically threw a napkin on his tray table and asked curtly, "Water," without presenting any other options. Throughout the boarding process, she found excuses to walk past his seat repeatedly, each time checking his seat number against her manifest. Other passengers began to notice, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere in the cabin. Some cast sympathetic glances his way, while others pretended not to notice, burying their faces deeper in their magazines or electronic devices. He sat quietly, maintaining his dignity while reviewing his own flight plans for tomorrow on his tablet. Years of experience in the aviation industry had taught him that reacting emotionally would only escalate the situation. Instead, he focused on his upcoming flight schedule, weather patterns, and route planning, knowing that professionalism was the best response to prejudice. Little did anyone know that in just a few hours, this seemingly routine flight would turn into a situation where expertise mattered far more than appearances, and assumptions would be challenged in the most dramatic way possible. For now, though, he simply settled into his seat, took a sip of his water, and watched through the window as the ground crew prepared the aircraft for departure. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same flight attendant who was treating him with such obvious disdain might soon be taking orders from him on another flight. But he had learned long ago that changing people's minds required patience and time. Sometimes it also required something more dramatic, though he had no way of knowing just how dramatic this particular flight was about to become. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the tension in first class continued to simmer. The flight attendant's behavior had shifted from subtle discrimination to increasingly obvious displays of prejudice. Each interaction became another small battle of dignity versus discrimination, played out at 35,000 feet above the ground. During the meal service, she worked her way through first class, offering passengers their pre-ordered meals with practiced efficiency. "The salmon or beef tenderloin?" she asked each person warmly. However, when she reached his seat, she practically dropped the meal tray on his table without a word, not even offering him a choice, despite his having pre-ordered the salmon like many other passengers. A young woman across the aisle noticed the difference in treatment. She had been watching the interactions unfold since boarding, her face showing increasing discomfort with each incident. When the flight attendant walked away, she leaned over slightly and whispered, "That's not right. You should complain to the airline." He gave her a small, appreciative smile but shook his head slightly. After 15 years in aviation, he knew that sometimes the best response was no response at all. Besides, he had learned to pick his battles carefully, and right now he was more focused on reviewing weather patterns for his flight tomorrow than engaging with someone's prejudices. The flight attendant's behavior continued to escalate. She kept finding reasons to walk past his seat, checking and rechecking his tray table, asking him to put his seat in the upright position when it already was, and questioning whether his laptop was in airplane mode despite having seen him switch it on herself. During one such interaction, she noticed his tablet displaying weather radar patterns and flight paths. Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Sir, are you looking at restricted aviation information?" she demanded loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. The accusation in her voice was clear. He took a deep breath before responding calmly, "No, ma'am. These are public weather maps." He didn't mention that he was reviewing them for his flight tomorrow. There was no point in explaining himself to someone who had already made up their mind about him. An elderly gentleman in the row behind him cleared his throat disapprovingly at the flight attendant's behavior. "Young lady," he spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of years, "I believe you're being unnecessarily confrontational." The flight attendant flushed red, but moved on without responding. The atmosphere in first class had become noticeably uncomfortable. Some passengers were openly watching the interactions now, while others pretended to be absorbed in their books or movies, though their tense postures gave away their awareness of the situation. A businessman 2 rows ahead kept glancing back sympathetically. During a quiet moment, he walked past on his way to the restroom and quietly said, "I'm documenting everything." This kind of behavior is unacceptable in 2025. The support was appreciated, but the passenger couldn't know that this situation would resolve itself in a way none of them could have anticipated. As the flight progressed, the flight attendant's attitude seemed to worsen rather than improve. When turbulence hit and the seatbelt sign came on, she immediately marched to his seat. "Sir, your seatbelt needs to be fastened," she announced loudly, despite his belt being clearly buckled and visible. He remained composed, simply lifting his blanket slightly to show the fastened belt. Another flight attendant, who had noticed her colleague's behavior, gave him an apologetic look as she passed by. She tried to intervene a few times, taking over service to his seat, but the first flight attendant kept finding reasons to return and check on him. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a commercial airline pilot with thousands of hours of flight time, being treated as if he didn't belong on an airplane. He had commanded aircraft through thunderstorms, handled emergency situations, and taught other pilots, yet today he was being treated as a suspicious character simply because of his appearance. Little did anyone know that in less than an hour, everything would change. The very skills this flight attendant seemed to doubt would become crucial to everyone's survival. As he sat there, maintaining his professional composure despite the continuous microaggressions, he had no way of knowing that this flight was about to become one of the most important of his career, not as a passenger, but as someone who would need to step up and take command in a crisis that would challenge everything this flight attendant thought she knew about him. For now, though, he simply adjusted his seat slightly, continued reviewing his flight plans, and maintained his dignity in the face of prejudice. Years of experience had taught him that sometimes the best response to ignorance was simply to rise above it, though he didn't yet know just how literally that would prove true on this flight. The first sign that something was wrong came about 3 hours into the flight. The plane had been cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet. Passengers settled into their routines of movies, books, and fitful airplane naps. Even the discriminatory flight attendant had finally stopped her constant surveillance, busy with duties in the galley. A subtle change in the aircraft's engine sound caught his attention. As a veteran pilot, he was attuned to every whisper and whine of jet engines, and something about this one made him look up from his tablet. Most passengers wouldn't have noticed, but years of experience had trained his ears to pick up the slightest variations. Moments later, the cockpit door opened, and the co-pilot stepped out, his face tight with concern. He whispered something to one of the flight attendants, whose eyes widened slightly. She nodded and hurried to the back of the plane, presumably to retrieve something from the medical kit. The co-pilot's worry was visible as he scanned the cabin, though he was clearly trying to maintain a professional demeanor. Something was definitely wrong in the cockpit. Years of experience had taught our protagonist to read these subtle signs, the way the co-pilot's hands were slightly tense, how he kept glancing back at the cockpit door, the unusually long time the captain had been silent on the passenger announcements. A flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, trying to sound casual but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. If there are any medical professionals on board, please press your call button immediately. Several call buttons chimed throughout the cabin. A young doctor from economy class made her way forward, followed by a nurse from the middle section. They were quickly escorted to the cockpit. The passengers watched with growing concern, whispering among themselves and craning their necks to see what was happening. 10 minutes passed. The doctor emerged from the cockpit, her expression grave as she spoke quietly with the co-pilot. Our protagonist could read their body language. This wasn't a minor situation. The captain was in serious trouble. The prejudiced flight attendant was now pacing nervously near the galley, her earlier attitude replaced by visible anxiety. The facade of superiority had cracked, revealing the human fear underneath. She jumped slightly when the co-pilot approached her, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. More time passed. The tension in the cabin was palpable now. Passengers had stopped pretending to watch their movies or read their books. Everyone could sense that something serious was unfolding, even if they didn't know exactly what it was. The co-pilot emerged again, this time looking even more concerned. He huddled with the flight attendants, and their conversation became more animated. The pilot could catch snippets of their discussion. Words like diversion and medical emergency drifted back to where he sat. Through the window, he noticed they had started a gradual turn, likely preparing for an emergency landing. But the weather outside had deteriorated significantly. Dark clouds loomed ahead, and the plane had already begun experiencing moderate turbulence. This wouldn't be a simple diversion. The flight attendant who had been giving him trouble all flight was now visibly shaking as she tried to maintain her composure while securing the cabin. Gone was her earlier condescending attitude, replaced by barely concealed panic. She nearly dropped a cup of water she was carrying to the cockpit. Suddenly, the plane shuddered more violently. Several passengers gasped. The co-pilot's voice came over the intercom, steady but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a medical situation in the cockpit. Please remain calm and seated with your seat belts fastened." The announcement did little to calm the growing anxiety in the cabin. A child started crying somewhere in economy class. An elderly passenger began asking loudly if they were going to crash. The flight attendants tried their best to maintain order, but their own worry was evident. The doctor emerged from the cockpit again, this time with an urgent request. "Is there anyone on board with flight experience? Any pilots or flight instructors?" Her voice carried through the cabin, the desperation clear despite her professional tone. This was the moment when prejudice and reality were about to collide head-on. The same man who had been treated with suspicion and disdain for the past 3 hours was about to become everyone's best hope for safety. He reached for his pilot's credentials in his jacket pocket, knowing that in the next few minutes, everything would change. The flight attendant who had questioned his very presence in first class was about to learn a powerful lesson about judging people based on appearance rather than ability. As he stood up, he could feel the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. This was about saving lives. And as the plane entered another patch of turbulence, he knew that every second of his 15 years of flying experience was about to be put to the test. The moment he stood up from his seat, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The same flight attendant who had been treating him with suspicion all flight watched with wide eyes as he pulled out his airline ID and captain's credentials from his jacket pocket. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then devastating realization. "I'm a commercial airline captain with 15 years of experience," he said calmly, making his way toward the cockpit. "I fly this exact aircraft model as my regular route." His voice carried naturally through the quiet cabin, steady and professional, a sharp contrast to the earlier tension. The doctor's face lit up with relief. "Thank goodness," she said, quickly leading him toward the cockpit. As they walked, she briefed him on the situation. The captain had experienced severe chest pains, and his left arm had gone numb, classic heart attack symptoms. His condition was deteriorating rapidly. The prejudiced flight attendant stood frozen in the galley, her earlier arrogance replaced by a look of absolute mortification. Other passengers who had witnessed her previous behavior were now watching her reaction, some shaking their heads disapprovingly. The co-pilot opened the cockpit door, relief washing over his face as he saw the credentials. "You're a captain, thank God. We need to divert to the nearest airport, but we've got weather issues." His voice was steady but carried the strain of someone dealing with multiple emergencies at once. As our protagonist stepped into the cockpit, the seriousness of the situation became immediately clear. The captain was pale and sweating, clearly in severe distress. The medical professionals had done their best to stabilize him, but he needed immediate hospital care. "I'll take the left seat," he said professionally, already settling into command mode. "Brief me on our fuel status and the weather situation." The natural authority in his voice seemed to calm everyone in the cockpit instantly. This was clearly a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The co-pilot quickly updated him on their situation. They had enough fuel for a diversion, but a massive storm system stood between them and the nearest suitable airport. The weather radar showed serious turbulence ahead, and they'd need to navigate through it carefully. Back in the cabin, word had started spreading about what was happening. The prejudiced flight attendant had to continue her duties, now serving passengers who had witnessed her earlier behavior toward the very person who was about to save their lives. Some gave her pointed looks, while others simply ignored her completely. A young passenger spoke up loudly enough for everyone to hear. "So the man you were harassing all flight is actually a pilot. And now he's the one who's going to help save us." The flight attendant's face flushed deep red as she hurried past without responding. In the cockpit, the new captain was already coordinating with air traffic control, his voice calm and measured as he declared their emergency and requested priority handling. He worked seamlessly with the co-pilot, their shared professional training transcending any social barriers that might have existed moments before. The doctor and nurse continued to care for the ill captain, who had been carefully moved to the crew rest area. Every few minutes, they updated the cockpit on his condition. Time was critical. They needed to get him to a hospital as quickly as possible. Through the cockpit window, they could see the wall of dark clouds ahead. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the massive storm system they would need to navigate through. But now, with a seasoned captain at the controls, there was a sense of confidence in the cockpit that hadn't been there before. The co-pilot couldn't help but mention what everyone was thinking. "I saw how she was treating you back there." I wanted to say something, but he left the sentence unfinished, focusing on the weather radar instead. "Let's focus on getting everyone safely on the ground," the captain replied, his eyes scanning the instruments as he plotted the best route through the storm. Sometimes the best response to prejudice is simply doing your job well. The flight attendant who had been discriminating against him now had to enter the cockpit to bring them water and updates about the passenger cabin. Each time she could barely meet his eyes, her earlier superiority completely deflated. But he remained professional, giving her clear, courteous instructions about preparing the cabin for potential turbulence. Outside the cockpit, passengers could feel the aircraft beginning to turn, banking toward their emergency diversion airport. The same folks who had witnessed the earlier discrimination were now comforted knowing that the target of that prejudice was the one guiding them to safety. Little did they know that the most challenging part of their journey was still ahead. The storm loomed before them, its dark clouds concealing the true extent of the turbulence they would face. But now they had someone at the controls who had earned his position through years of experience and dedication, someone who had faced and overcome prejudice just as he would now face and overcome this storm. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the flight attendant who had spent hours questioning his very presence on the plane. Now, every soul on board would depend on his skills and experience to guide them safely through the crisis ahead. It was a powerful reminder that capability and character have nothing to do with appearance, and everything to do with what lies beneath the surface. The storm ahead looked like a dark wall of clouds, occasionally lit up by flashes of lightning. In the cockpit, the newly installed captain studied the weather radar intently. The situation was more serious than passengers realized. This wasn't just about getting through some turbulence. They were facing a decision that would test every bit of his 15 years of flying experience. "We've got a serious problem," the co-pilot said, pointing to the radar. "The storm cell is intensifying. It's now level 5 severity." His voice carried the weight of knowing just how dangerous that rating was. Level 5 meant extreme turbulence, the kind that could damage an aircraft. The sick captain's condition was deteriorating in the crew rest area. The doctor came to the cockpit with an update. "His blood pressure is dropping. We need to get him to a hospital within the next hour, or things could get much worse." Time was running out, but their path was blocked by one of the worst storms the captain had seen in years. They had two options: try to go around the storm system, which would take precious time they didn't have, or find a safe path through it to reach the nearest airport. The captain's hands moved steadily over the controls as he processed all the information. Behind him, in the passenger cabin, over 200 lives were counting on his decision, including the flight attendant who had spent hours doubting his very right to be on this plane. "Air traffic control, this is Flight 2317, he radioed, his voice calm and clear. "We need all available weather data for possible routes through this system. We have a medical emergency on board requiring immediate landing." The controller's voice crackled back. "Flight 2317, be advised, all other aircraft are diverting around. The storm's vertical development is now reaching 45,000 feet. The concern in the controller's voice was evident. But the captain had noticed something on the radar, a narrow corridor where the storm's intensity was slightly less severe. It would be like threading a needle, requiring precise flying and perfect timing, but it might be their only chance to get the sick captain to medical help in time. "I see a possible route," he told the co-pilot, pointing to the radar. "It's tight, but if we time it right, we can slip through that gap between the two main cells." The co-pilot studied the radar, then nodded slowly, trusting his more experienced colleague's judgment. In the cabin, passengers could feel the tension building. The plane had slowed down, and the light turbulence they were experiencing was just a taste of what was coming. The prejudiced flight attendant was now moving through the cabin, her hands shaking slightly as she checked seat belts and secured loose items. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight crew. We're about to experience some significant turbulence as we make our emergency landing. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened tightly and all loose items are secured." As they approached the storm, the true scale of what they faced became apparent. The clouds ahead were not the usual gray. They were an angry dark purple, churning with violent energy. Lightning flashed inside them like nature's warning signals. The first real hit of turbulence struck like a giant's hand shaking the plane. Passengers gasped, and someone in the back screamed. The captain's hands remained steady on the controls, his eyes focused on his instruments as he guided the massive aircraft. Approaching the corridor, he announced to the co-pilot, "When I give the word, I need full power. The timing would have to be perfect. Too early or too late, and they'd be caught in the worst part of the storm." The flight attendant who had treated him so poorly now stood braced in her jump seat, her face a mixture of fear and regret as she watched him work through the cockpit door. Every shake of the plane seemed to remind her of how wrong her assumptions had been. The turbulence intensified. Overhead bins rattled despite being securely latched. The airplane groaned as it fought against the powerful forces of nature. But the captain's hands never wavered, his concentration absolute as he guided them through the narrow, safe corridor he'd spotted. "Now," he commanded, and the co-pilot pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared with increased power as they threaded their way between the storm cells. Lightning flashed around them, illuminating the cockpit in brilliant bursts. The plane bucked and shuddered. Warning alarms beeped as they encountered wind shear, but the captain had anticipated this. He adjusted their course with the precision of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of situation. Through it all, he remained focused and calm. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. This was about using every bit of skill and experience he had to save lives, including the life of someone who had judged him without knowing anything about his capabilities. The doctor appeared again at the cockpit door. The captain's pulse is getting weaker. How much longer? The urgency in her voice was clear. 10 minutes to landing, he responded, never taking his eyes off his instruments. Tell the medical team on the ground to be ready. We'll need immediate transfer. The storm threw everything it had at them, but the captain's read of the radar had been perfect. They emerged from the worst of it into clearer air, the airport now visible in the distance. In the cabin, passengers broke into spontaneous applause, not yet knowing that their challenges weren't quite over. The landing would still be tricky, the winds were gusting unpredictably, and they had a critically ill patient who needed to be transferred to medical care as quickly as possible. But they had made it through the worst of the storm, guided by the very man who had been judged as not belonging just hours before. The airport appeared through the breaking clouds, its runway lights glowing like a beacon of hope in the gray aftermath of the storm. But landing a massive passenger jet in these conditions would be far from simple. Strong, gusting winds still buffeted the aircraft, and precious minutes were ticking away for the ill captain in the crew rest area. Flight 2317, wind is gusting to 35 knots, current direction 290 degrees, varying 30 degrees, the tower controller's voice crackled through the radio. Even to non-pilots, those numbers sounded dangerous. The co-pilot glanced nervously at the windsock visible near the runway. It was whipping wildly in different directions. In the cabin, passengers could feel the aircraft being thrown around by the wind, despite being out of the worst of the storm. The flight attendant who had shown such prejudice earlier was now moving through the cabin one last time, her face pale as she checked seat belts. Every time the plane shook, she grabbed the nearest seat back to steady herself. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're on final approach to Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. The weather is rough, so you'll feel some bumps. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened tightly." His calm tone helped settle the nervous passengers, but the reality in the cockpit was more intense. This would be what pilots call a maximum performance landing. They needed to get down quickly for the sick captain, but they also needed to do it safely in dangerous wind conditions. Through the windscreen, the runway appeared and disappeared as clouds swept past. Rain pelted the glass in sheets, making visibility even more challenging. But the captain's hands remained steady on the controls, his eyes constantly scanning between his instruments and the runway ahead. "Gear down," he commanded. The landing gear dropped into position with a reassuring thud. "Flaps 30. The co-pilot responded professionally, extending the flaps to their landing position. The plane shuddered as the wind caught the extended surfaces. A particularly strong gust hit them from the side, pushing the massive aircraft off its approach path. Passengers gasped as the plane rolled slightly, but the captain was already correcting, his inputs so smooth that most didn't realize how close they'd come to having to abort the landing. The doctor appeared briefly in the cockpit doorway. "His blood pressure is still dropping. How much longer?" 5 minutes, the captain replied without taking his eyes off his instruments. "Tell the emergency crews we'll need immediate access to the left side of the aircraft." The ground was getting closer now. Through the rain-streaked windows, they could see emergency vehicles already positioned along the runway, their lights flashing urgently in the gray afternoon light. The airport had prepared well for their arrival. Another gust rocked the aircraft. The captain's hands moved constantly, making tiny adjustments to keep them on the correct approach path. Years of training and experience were evident in every smooth movement, every split-second decision. At 500 feet above the ground, a warning alarm blared in the cockpit. "Wind shear, wind shear." The automated system warned. This was exactly what they didn't need. A sudden change in wind speed or direction that could slam an aircraft into the ground if not handled correctly. But the captain had been expecting this possibility. His reactions were immediate and precise. He increased power to the engines and adjusted their pitch, riding out the wind shear like a skilled sailor navigating rough seas. The runway threshold passed beneath them. The captain began their flare. The delicate maneuver where the nose is raised slightly for touchdown. This would be the most critical moment where all his skill and experience would come into play. A last gust of wind tried to push them off center, but he corrected with textbook precision. The huge aircraft touched down so smoothly that some passengers didn't realize they were on the ground until they felt the thrust reversers engage. "Nice landing," the co-pilot said with genuine admiration as they turned off the runway. Behind them, through the cockpit door, they could hear passengers breaking into spontaneous applause. Emergency vehicles were already moving alongside them as they taxied. The captain brought the aircraft to a stop on the taxiway, knowing that every second counted for their ill colleague. Ground crews were positioning stairs even before the engines had fully spun down. The flight attendant who had caused so much trouble earlier now stood near the front exit, watching as medical teams rushed aboard. The man she had treated with such disdain had just pulled off a landing that many pilots would have diverted from, saving precious minutes that might make the difference for the sick captain. As emergency medical technicians carefully transferred the ill captain from the aircraft, the other crew members gathered in the galley. The look on the prejudiced flight attendant's face showed that she was struggling with the weight of her earlier behavior. The captain remained focused on his duties, coordinating with ground crew and ensuring all passengers would be properly accommodated. His professionalism never wavered, even as other crew members came up to thank him and shake his hand. In the terminal, passengers gathered at the windows to watch the medical teams work. Many were already on their phones, sharing the story of how their flight had been saved by the very man who had faced discrimination on board. It was a powerful lesson about prejudice and capability, played out at 35,000 feet and ending with a display of skill that none of them would soon forget. The story of Flight 2317 spread quickly across social media and news outlets. Within hours of landing, passengers had shared videos of the dramatic events, and by the next morning, it had become a powerful conversation starter about prejudice in everyday life. In the hospital, the original captain was recovering well. The doctors confirmed that the emergency landing had made a crucial difference. The quick arrival at the hospital had allowed them to treat his heart attack before any permanent damage occurred. He asked to meet the pilot who had saved his life, and their emotional reunion was captured by a nurse's phone camera. "I heard what happened on the flight before things went wrong," the recovering captain said, his voice still weak but sincere. "I want you to know that's not what our airline stands for. Thank you for rising above it all and saving my life." The story caught fire online, with the video of the landing being shared millions of times. Aviation experts appeared on news shows, explaining just how challenging the emergency approach had been. The weather radar images showed the severity of the storm, making the successful landing even more impressive. The airline couldn't ignore what had happened. 3 days after the incident, they called a press conference. Their CEO stood before cameras and microphones, addressing not just the heroic landing, but the bigger issue it had revealed. "What happened on Flight 2317 shows us two things," the CEO stated firmly. "First, the incredible skill and professionalism of our pilots. But second, and just as importantly, it shows us that we still have work to do in addressing bias and prejudice within our own ranks." The prejudiced flight attendant had requested a meeting with the pilot who saved them. In a small conference room at the airline's headquarters, she finally had the chance to apologize face to face. Her hands shook as she spoke. "I've spent days thinking about how I treated you," she said, her voice trembling. "I made assumptions based on how you looked, and I was so terribly wrong. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that you've changed how I see things." The pilot listened quietly to her apology. His response was characteristically thoughtful. "We all have biases. The important thing is recognizing them and choosing to change. I hope this experience helps others realize that capability and character can't be judged by appearance." The airline took concrete action. They announced a comprehensive anti-bias training program for all employees, using the events of Flight 2317 as a case study. The flight attendant voluntarily became part of the training, sharing her story as a warning about the dangers of prejudice. Letters and emails poured in from around the country. Many were from minority professionals who had faced similar discrimination. Others came from people who admitted the story had made them examine their own biases. A high school teacher in Detroit wrote about using the incident to teach her students about prejudice and professionalism. The pilot received numerous awards and recognition, but he remained humble. When asked to speak at aviation conferences, he focused not on the dramatic landing but on the broader lessons about judgment and respect. His message was always clear: skill, dedication, and professional capability know no color or creed. 6 months after the incident, the airline invited him to help redesign their hiring practices. They wanted to ensure that qualified candidates wouldn't face barriers because of how they looked or where they came from. His experience, both as a pilot and as someone who had faced discrimination, proved invaluable in creating more inclusive policies. The prejudiced flight attendant went through a profound change. She requested to be part of the airline's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, sharing her story as a testament to the importance of confronting one's own biases. Her honesty about her mistakes and her commitment to change earned her respect from colleagues. A year later, a documentary filmmaker approached the pilot about telling his story. The resulting film wasn't just about that dramatic flight. It explored the broader narrative of prejudice in professional settings and the importance of judging people by their abilities rather than their appearance. The film included interviews with passengers from Flight 2317, including a young girl who had been inspired to become a pilot herself after witnessing the events. "I learned that day that you shouldn't let anyone tell you what you can or can't do based on how you look," she said, her eyes bright with determination. The story of Flight 2317 became more than just an aviation incident. It became a powerful reminder that heroism and capability can come from anyone, regardless of appearance. In training rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms across the country, it sparked important conversations about bias and prejudice. The pilot continued flying, earning the respect of colleagues and passengers alike. But his greatest legacy wasn't the dramatic landing in terrible weather. It was the way his professional response to prejudice helped change attitudes and open doors for others who might face similar discrimination. As he often said in his speeches, "That storm we flew through was dangerous, but the storm of prejudice in our society is even more treacherous. The only way through both is with skill, courage, and the willingness to see beyond our preconceptions to what truly matters."